Thank you, Chetan, and thank you everybody for being here. Looking forward to chatting with you. So yeah, like you said, my undergraduate and my training was as an engineer, and so I started out working as an engineer in corporate America. Well, started out in the UK, and then moved to the US and continued working in corporate America for decades. Um, I was always doing some writing on the side, and like many of you, I would take, the odd writing workshop. In those days, there wasn't online stuff, so it would mainly be weekends or evenings. I would use my vacation time off from work, my paid time off from work to go to the University of Iowa or University of Michigan, wherever I could go to writing conferences or whatever, and what I could afford at the time as well. So yeah, I did that for decades, and part of it, the reason I never just made the complete switch was, when you're not a citizen yet in the US. I had a work permit. I was working toward getting my green card. You're held hostage to that situation. You're not able to change jobs or companies. You have to restart the whole process if that happens. So I was pretty much hostage to that, and so that was my limitation as far as where I could go and what I could do. And once all of that settled and I got my citizenship, of course things got a little bit easier, and I felt more confidence in my work. And then I took a very drastic step because I didn't feel I could be a slave to two masters. I couldn't do the writing on the side and still continue up the corporate ladder. I'd reached a point where I was doing a lot of travel. The work was just all consuming. And so I basically gave up the whole career, and I moved back to India in 2014 for a few years so that I could do the writing and the translating. I had given myself a 2-year window. That was my thing, that, if I don't succeed in finishing, doesn't matter what condition the book is in, but if I don't have a book length work, after that 2-year period, then I'm going to give it all up and go back and just work again, because obviously you can only, live off your savings for so long, which is what I was doing. I was living off my savings.
Wow. Okay.
And then so it was a gamble, much like, I guess, Chetan, you took a gamble when you started the retreat. You also left your job, I know. So that, luckily for me, I did end up starting. What kept me going was around 2015-16, I started to get my work out there and getting it published. So that helped. And then the big vote of confidence came when Amazon used to have a journal, a literary journal called Day One. And the editor of that journal reached out because I had written this kind of longish, novella-ish, not novella quite, but a longish short story, and she wanted to publish it. And she did an interview and everything, and they paid me really well. I mean, the journal is now no longer there, but the thing is out there. The Day One story is still out there on Amazon. I still get royalties from it. But that was the big vote of confidence, because she talked to me on the phone. She's a well-known writer in the US, and she said, you should keep writing. You're doing good. So I thought, okay, well, and then I got a Pushcart finalist thing, and I won some other award for a short story. So all those little things help you, right? They keep you focused. I'd always been doing translating from a very young age on the side. Never thought of being a professional translator or even sending stuff out for publication. But when each of us killers, when my book length work, the thing that I had given myself 2 years, when that was finished, and I started sending it out to agents, the agent in India, Kanishka Gupta, who some of you may know of, he called me right away, like in half an hour of getting my email. And I was excited. I thought, oh, he wants to publish my book. And he says, well, we'll talk about your own book later. I'm interested in that translating that you mentioned in your bio. Do you have anything completed? Because I mentioned in my bio that, I do translation as well, Gujarati to English. And then that's when he told me, well, look, I talk to the editors all the time. Gujarati to English translators are very few and far between. So if you have anything, send it to me, and I think we can make it happen. So I ended up selling the translation work before I sold my own book, even though my own book was actually a finished product, and the translation was on speculation on the basis of 3 sample stories that I had translated. So I hadn't finished the translation work, but I sold it before I sold the completed work. So that's in the nutshell, and I'll stop there. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute, Chetan.
And so in the translation itself, it's all been Gujarati to English, right? Or have you also done Gujarati to Hindi or any others? No.
No, it's so far it's only been Gujarati to English. I've done a little bit of back translation, but that's not been published anywhere. I helped people write copy for other things where I did English to Gujarati.
Sure.
But I've not done any.
So after this call with Kanish, we know him well, and he's also been on the FDC with us, etc. But after your conversation, how does it go from there? Do you decide that you want to translate something? Does he make a suggestion, or is there an editor who has an idea for a translation? How does it work?
Well, so this Dhumketu was not commissioned, but to your point, so in my case, I already knew I wanted to translate Dhumketu because I had grown up hearing about him from my mother. He is the greatest short story writer, the pioneering modern Gujarati short story. And so, I think for me, I had already got some stories of his done. Okay. And so in that particular instance, it was more a case of Kanishka saying, all right, send it to me, send me a proposal. I did have to write a long, like 10, 12 page proposal, because when you don't have a complete work, so this is the case with translations and with nonfiction everywhere, not just in India, where if you don't have to have the work written before you send it, but you have to have a detailed proposal.
Sure.
And the proposal, Kanishka and I kind of went back and forth on the proposal a little bit. He asked me, hey, edit this, hey, change that, hey, add more of this, take that out. So he does have, because he's been doing this for so long, he has ideas on what will work in a proposal. Okay. And so he and I went back and forth on that, not so much on should we do Dhumketu. And he wasn't at that stage even telling me which stories would be interesting or anything like that. That comes from the editor. So once he sends that out, the proposal, he starts talking to editors at different publishers. And then he decides, for the most part, he'll come back and say, I've got 2 offers, I've got 3 offers, here's what they're saying. My recommendation is this, but it's your decision, and so that's what happened. The book did go to kind of a sort of auction process, if you like.
Okay, sure.
I think we had offers from pretty much everybody. But I ended up going with HarperCollins because Rahul Soni is himself a translator, the editor.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so I thought, oh gosh, wouldn't it be great to have your first translation and work with somebody who's actually an accomplished translator,
Yeah.
I thought, what could be better than that? He'll give me the right kind of feedback, I know.
Sure, yeah.
And so yeah, and I was a first-time translator, and I had not been trained as a translator, right? So that was really my main decision making. And then once I started working with Rahul, we decided, okay, he would ask me, what's your thinking on which stories you're selecting? How are we going to organize them? So all those conversations are after the fact, right? After you've done the translation. But yeah, that's how the process.
And so you've translated Dhumketu, you've also translated Varsha Adalja. Now, Dhumketu, I would imagine, is already in the public domain because it was written so long ago. So there is no royalty.
No, it's not yet. It's a few years. Dhumketu is still a few years from the public domain. But yeah, within the next 10 years, will be in the public domain.
So how does it work then? Do you have to take permission from somebody? Does the publisher take permission from somebody? How does that whole piece work out? I mean, he has an
Yes.
estate that's still there.
Yeah. I mean, the process is that you do need a written document from whoever owns the copyright. So if the author is alive, obviously that it's the author. If the author is not alive, it may be, their family members,
Right.
or in some cases even their publishers,
Sure.
might have. So it just depends. And so no publisher, whether it's in the US or in India, will sign you up for a translation, will sign a contract with you unless you have that documented permission for
Okay.
works that are not in the public domain. So if
Okay.
the work is not in the public domain and you don't have that written permission, you cannot sign a contract with a publisher.
All right.
Now, the challenge is that if you're dealing with people who don't know that process, in terms of if you're dealing with people that you have to get copyright from and they don't know this process, they're going to get sometimes a little difficult. And I did have some of that difficulty initially, where in the Dhumketu case, his publishers were also involved. And they, for whatever reason, they were like, well, you have to tell us what you're going to get paid and how much you're going to give give the family and all of this before we give you the permission. And I said, well, this is a chicken and egg thing because the publisher won't even sign anything with, so I can't even start talking about money, until so I think you have to be very clear up of what the process is.
Okay.
And if it's in the public domain, then it's much easier.
Sure. All right. And does it change much if you're doing an online translation like the one that you had, the short story that you had, which was done by Varsha, that seemed to be
Well, so
on?
that's actually an excerpt. So I'm actually in the process of translating a 600-page novel by
Okay.
Varsha Dholi.
Right.
Now, so the online thing was I was guest editing this whole Gujarati to English translation issue for Words Without Borders. And they said, what do you have that you can add because I assembled a group of translators and they had all submitted work. And then the Words Without Borders people said, well, we should have something of yours as well. And
Right.
so I gave them the opening of the novel.
It's
And the
pretty.
novel is still in progress. It's been contracted with HarperCollins, and that should hopefully be finished. But it's a 600-page novel in the original Gujarati, so it's going to be longer even in the English. But yeah, that particular one, I had reached out to Varsha Dholi because I loved that novel. She's familiar with the process of translation. She comes from a family of writers herself. She's a very prolific writer herself. And so she knew exactly what I didn't have to worry about explaining anything much to her. So I got the permission from her, and Kanishka then took it out again as he did before, and that's how that went. So the excerpt was really, it was just because I was already working on it.
And so in a instance like that, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm just curious, but so does the money get split between you and the author, or is that something that's the publisher figures out? How does that work in terms of royalty?
Well, so the publisher doesn't. There is a split. Yes, there is a split, and that's entirely up to you and the author as far as what the split should be. Industry standards tend to be either 50-50 or 60-40, depending on the work that's involved. The publisher will then take care of the dispersal of the money.
Right.
So you don't have to get involved in that. They will generally get involved. They will take care of what money goes where to whom and all of that.
Sure.
But the discussion, the money discussion, is obviously something the translator will have with the copyright holder, and
Sure.
that.
And have all these translations only been published in India, or has any of them also made it to outside of India?
The Dhumketu one did make it to outside of in 2022. It was published by one of the biggest translation publishers in the US, Deep Vellum.
Nice.
And it just is that just so happens they're a Dallas-based publisher, but they're very well known across the US, and you know, they're known that their focus is translation.
What did you say the name was? Sorry, I missed that.
Deep Vellum,
Okay.
DEEP, and then VELLUM, Deep Vellum. So they're known. That, you know, and they, what was interesting was my Dhumketu book was their very first South Asian translation. They're not, they've published from everywhere in the world. And Will Evans, who runs it, his goal, he tells everyone, his goal is to have published from every country in the world. So that is, you know, that's one of the things he's always working toward. And so, yeah, not only was it the first South Asian translation that they published, it was also the first Gujarati to English literary translation anywhere in the US.
Okay.
You know, even though Gujarati is the third most spoken language in the Indian American or South Asian American diaspora, the third most spoken language. But this was the first book from Gujarati to English published in 2022. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. So, folks, the one other thing I do want to tell you all about Jenny is that she's not just prolific as a writer, she's also very, very generous in giving. So she has had this podcast that she used to run, which is now, I think, on sabbatical, which is called Desi Books, which was very, very popular, and I know it got a lot of attention. And her own website is called jennybhattwriter.com. And on jennybhattwriter.com, she has this whole section called "We Are All Translators." You write in your email where you corrected me, but it's WAAT. I'm just going to post the link in the chat and also in the WhatsApp group. But the amazing thing about that page and that link is how much insight and how much fantastic content and material is available to writers there. And it seems like you've been working on it. Like there's like, you know, it's not just 5 or 10 articles. It's like 70 or 80 probably articles that are out there. So tell us about, you know, why is it just passion? Is it, you know, I couldn't see a commercial motive. So if you're doing it out of just love, or I mean,
yeah,
tell us about that. Yeah,
I don't get, I don't do any advertising of anything. I don't get any money for it. What happened was, I mean, I would get asked questions. People would email me from my website about translation, and I think it's only because people knew me from Desi Books, like you said, and they felt I was accessible. I was on social media a lot. Those, you know, I'm on hiatus right now, but I was very active. And so I thought, you know, I would be sending responses and emails, and I thought I just need to have a place to collect all this and just direct people to that. That was one reason why I started. The other is a lot of times, you know, there's my own thinking that I want to organize and put down, and, you know, especially with translation, some of the technicalities of, okay, when do you foreignize? When do you domesticate? What do you do with neologisms? You know, there are all these technical things that I was, because again, like I said, I wasn't a professionally trained translator. So I was thinking through and reading up on all of these things, talking to other translators or whatever. And so I started putting my thoughts in this newsletter. And the newsletter is called "We Are All Translators." That started from, I had written something in 2020 for poets and writers, a little piece called "We Are All Translators," and somehow that stuck, and so I used it for the newsletter. But yeah, so I started with that, and then what happened was, for 3 years I had been teaching historical fiction writing workshops here at Writing Workshop Dallas. And then when I ended that, because I had to start at the university, so I ended that, and my students, former students from that, were like, "Oh, you know, you should keep telling, you know, we'd love to know more, and, you know, you don't give up teaching." So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to start putting all that into a historical fiction newsletter. So I have 2 newsletters now, which I try to do monthly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so that one's fairly new. I only started that last year, and then I took a break because of the semester. But yes, I have 2 newsletters. One is the translation, the other is historical fiction. And yeah, it's really more about just me trying to organize my own thoughts and share it. And then yes, it does, you know, I have a good list of subscribers, and they do all like to jump in and comment every now and then, which is nice because I'm not on social media as much these days.
Yeah, I think as a writer, that's always a tough call that you have to take. So, so interesting. I didn't know that your translation kind of came in on the shoulder of, We Are All Killers. But how does that interface work? Does the translation impact your writing, or does the writing impact the translation, or are those really like two separate buckets? How does that world operate?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing is that being being a translator makes you such a close reader, right, of somebody else's work. You're paying attention to every word, every phrase. You are thinking through a lot of the craft elements, because obviously you're not ever doing a literal translation. Excuse me. So you're trying to understand what the original writer's craft is. So I think in terms of just paying more attention, doing more active reading, reading like a writer, you do a lot of that if you're a translator. I don't think, for me personally, because my own writing style, I was a writer before I was a translator. My own writing style is different from, say, Dhumketu or Varsha Dalja.
Right.
So I don't think their writing craft necessarily has influenced me. But I would say, just from an anthropological sense, it's a different literary tradition. I write more in the Western contemporary tradition, right? Because that's what I'm trained in.
Sure.
In the US. But they write from a particular, the Gujarati literary lineage that they are part of, which is a very rich lineage going back centuries. And so they're writing in a different tradition. And I feel enriched being able to read and participate so closely in that tradition. And I'm sure there are other subtle ways that the translation is affecting my writing. Not not in the storytelling, because I tell different stories than they do, but I just think that becoming such a close reader of somebody else's work and thinking very carefully at the word and the sentence level as a translator helps you as a writer as well.
Right. Great. Yeah. And when I'm looking at the work of, say, somebody like Dhumketu, there seems to be this universal, fascination with Amrapali that is, and that is all always historical fiction. Even when you're looking at something like Postman, it seems to have a small element of magic realism in it. So, by the way, I would recommend to everybody, do check out Jenny's books and do try and grab them. They're available in India as well. There is an audiobook, and there is also Kindle editions, so you can definitely get them. And of course, the print is always there. So you have every option that you might want for this. So does that color your choice of genre or theme? Like, you're also writing historical fiction. You're also writing magic realism. So is that just a coincidence, or is there some cause and effect happening there?
No, it wasn't. It was the other way around. So I've always been interested in those genres as a reader and even as a writer. So some of my short stories are also historical and magical realism in Each of Us Killers.
Right.
I've also written, and I was doing that writing long before I even started translating Dhumketu.
Oh,
so I was always interested in those genres myself. When I came to Dhumketu, one of the reasons I was drawn to Dhumketu was the fact that he, aside from being a prolific short story writer and being the pioneer of the modern Gujarati short story, he is well known for his 26 historical novels.
Right.
So he's a great historical. He's written all about the Gupta Yug, the Maurya Yug, the Chalukya Yug. Amrapali is just a short story in the collection, but he's written a whole novel on her, in the early 20th century. So one of the reasons I was drawn to his work is because of the historical element. With Varsha Dalja too, the novel I'm doing right now, it's set in pre-independence time, and
Yeah.
it goes from the 1920s to the 1970s, and that's also a historical novel. Now, she does not have magical realism, but she does have historical. It's historical fiction. So I'm certainly drawn to translate the genres that I particularly enjoy. So it's more that I started there, and that's the translation work that I go to. That would be the cause and effect, that I was already interested in those genres.
So it was the other way around. Very interesting.
Mhm.
And when you read the Varsha Dalja work, it seems to be really deeply steeped in caste. It's a lot about the caste of the time and how segregated society was, and it's a comment on that. And when I'm looking at and you and I were chatting about the workshop that Revati is doing for us, Revati Lal, and she's also doing a very heavy dose of writing around, although her book is more about religion, but she is doing a lot about caste in that workshop with us as well. So I'm quite looking forward to that. It's going to be quite a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, Varsha's work, Varsha is a feminist writer. She's always been a feminist writer. And her work, that novel, it checks off almost all the boxes. There's gender issues related to women, in the 1920s in rural Gujarat and the issues they faced.
Right.
There's things, female infanticide, child marriage. There's all these issues that were prevalent at the time, right? Widow outcast issues. There's Hindu-Muslim religion issues, caste issues. So she pretty much covers the whole gamut in that novel.
Right. Okay, cool. And in terms of your, trajectory from here, now you're getting a PhD, you're also teaching at the university. You have been teaching, outside of the academic frame already in Dallas for about 4 years now. Is it 4 years?
Yes.
Right.
3-4 years, yeah.
And you had to stop doing that because of the academic requirements at the university?
I had to stop doing it because the university has a contractual requirement that I cannot teach elsewhere while I'm teaching at the university. So I had to,
That's interesting, because we get a lot of people who teach for us and who are also working at the university, but maybe it's not happening at the same time then.
Yeah, if it's not happening at the same time, they're okay, but you can't teach while you're in the semester.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right. So, well, I don't have any further questions at this point in time. It's been great chatting with you. Participants here, I'm just putting this back to gallery view. Are there any questions that you guys have? Anything that you'd like to ask Jenny? We can get into a back and forth or Q&A now, if anybody has any questions. I was curious about one thing while we're waiting for these questions to come in, which was about publishing a short story collection. So each of us killers, was that also published in the US, or was it only an Indian publication?
No, that was just a US publication.
That was just a US
that
publication.
Never ended up being. So India, in India, I will tell you, short story collections are very hard to sell, especially if they're a debut.
Right.
And pretty much I was told by all the publishers and Kanishka himself, that go out with the translation, get your name made, and then we'll see about your own short story collection, because they're very hard to sell. If you're an established writer, you can do it, but if you look around, short story collections in India and even in the US now, quite frankly, are a hard sell.
Yeah, that's why I was asking, because I know that selling a short story collection in India is like almost impossible. We get to hear that all the time. So I thought, I didn't know that it was only published in the US. Okay, all right.
Yeah, so no, it was. And then eventually, I think when it did well in the US, and then I had some folks come out and say, I had publishing editors reach out and say, hey, do you have some other work? Not the collection, but do you have some other work? And I said, well,
yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's strange, because we also had Anand Neelkanthan on FDC. And one of the things we asked him, and he said he was struggling to publish a collection of short stories. Now, if Anand Neelkanthan, and he's this guy who wrote Bahubali and all of this stuff, and he's having a hard time with that, then I don't know what will happen to the rest of us. So yeah, it sounds hard. We have a question from Vikas. He's saying, how do you choose which book to translate? I would guess is what he meant.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I start with, I have to have some connection with the work, right? Because if I'm going to be spending so much time reading it so closely, I have to have some connection. And so with Dhumketu, I grew up with that writer. My mom had all his books. I inherited her collection. And so because I was already writing short stories, I thought, well, let's start with that. I have to tell people, do not underestimate. If you are picking a writer to translate who has a large oeuvre of short stories and you're trying to do a best of, that's a lot of work. I had to read 600 plus short stories, choose about 30 of them to translate, which then got narrowed down to like 25 or 26. So it was a lot of work. With the Adalja novel, again, you know, it was, I knew I wanted to translate her work as well, just because I wanted to go to a woman writer after I'd done Dhumketu. And so I kind of knew, and I started looking around her work. I could have picked a smaller novel. I probably should have picked a shorter novel. This is 600 pages.
Right.
But I feel like this novel, which she wrote in her 70s by hand over a period of 2 years or something, it's probably her finest work.
Nice.
And I felt like, you know, when you think about the fact that both Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, and Jinnah were both originally from Gujarat, and we have yet to read a Gujarati novel in English translation that is set in that pre-independence period and talks about the struggle for, you know, freedom and all of that. We have yet to see one of those in English translation, despite the fact that both Gandhi, Jinnah, Vallabhbhai Patel, I mean, these people all came from Gujarat. Gujarat was a hotbed. Sabarmati Ashram was a hotbed for all of this, you know. And we don't have, there have been novels in Gujarati set in that period, but we just don't have them in translation. And so I was drawn for that particular reason. So you know, that's on those specific works. But to answer the question in a general sense, you know, you're always drawn to something in translation because you want to start a conversation about it. The reason I do the translation, I've read the novel, I already love it. I mean, I'm not doing it just for me, right? I'm doing the translation so others can read it. Sure. And it's not just because, I think this will be entertaining. It's because a translation, at least for me, and working in what I call a minority language, is it's about an intervention, which is a word I'm taking from Rita Kothari. She often uses it. She's also a Gujarati to English and a Sindhi to English translator. And you know, it's an intervention because you're trying to create some discourse about a topic or an issue or a writer. So that's what would draw me to.
Yeah, well, Vikas, I hope that answers your question. Yeah, thanks for that. Kamal has a question which is right up what you and I were talking about earlier, which is when do you plan to do a historical fiction online workshop with HWR? So actually, Jenny and I were shooting the breeze about that just before this, but we were not thinking about online. We were thinking about doing it in person because Jenny would like to be in India. So we have something in the works, but it's not yet final. So I know why you're asking for an online one, Rajiv. Rajiv is a caregiver to old parents and he lives in Chandigarh. So he's not able to travel. So he's always looking for ways to do stuff online. So that's the reason.
You live in Chandigarh. Okay. That Chandigarh is my husband's hometown. So if I ever come there, I will reach out and maybe we can grab a coffee or something.
Great. So we'll keep you posted on what comes of this conversation. We're still figuring that out, Rajiv. Next question is from Shagun. He's saying, for getting a novel or a book of short stories published, A, should we be connecting with publishers, literary agents, or start with publishing stories in magazines or such platforms? And B, could you highlight the key factors to be considered in the process for getting a novel or a book of short stories published? Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
great
I'm
question.
thinking this would be in the US, in the Indian context, right, Shagun? I would imagine. So yeah, go ahead, please.
That's
Well, I
right.
would say both in the US and the Indian context. I mean, a short story collection is hard work, anyways. But if you can manage to get the good thing about a short story collection is because you've written these individual stories, you can send them out. And it definitely helps if you can send them out for publication in literary journals and magazines. I actually got my US publisher because of something he read of mine published in a literary venue. And then he reached out and said, do you already have a publisher for your collection? And I said, well, funny you should ask. I've been looking around. So, that's how it happened. So I would say definitely with short story collections, even with novels, to be honest, if you feel you have a polished enough excerpt, try and get that out there, because that never hurts. Never hurts. It gets your name out there. It also, if you're submitting to the right places, it will give you good editorial feedback. You'll get feedback from editors of these venues, and either they're going to tell you, well, this is great, but it's not working for me for this reason, or I'd love to publish it and it's great and please keep writing. So I think the feedback, as I said to you, that was for me very valuable when I was working in that 2014 to 2016 period on my collection. Just sending those short stories out there and getting feedback was definitely good. So I would say that that's important, getting your work out on platforms like that. I published on both US and Indian platforms. So I had a short story, for example, in the Indian Quarterly. I had work published at Scroll.in. So, I mean, I would say that you can be agnostic about, because everything's online now. And so, everything's visible to everybody. Whether you end up with an Indian publisher or a US publisher, it doesn't matter, as long as you've got work at reputable, respectable venues, right? So I think that's fine. And then should we be connecting with publishers or literary agents? With a short story collection, nobody will want to talk to you until you have a complete work. So it's not like a translation where I only had 3 short stories translated and I already had a contract. With the short story collection, they want you to send a complete manuscript. So you do have to have the full work before you can start talking with publishers or agents.
Okay. Then there is the next question is from Radhika. She's saying, could you give some tips about approaching the family or estate who owns a late famous writer's works, because they seem to take offense if you ask them for the rights for free. And
yeah, that's such a challenge. I'm telling you, that is a huge challenge in India. I almost, with the Dhumketu thing, it was because we had this middleman involved, who was not letting me access the family directly. It got to a point where I almost walked away and I started translating another writer. I don't, honestly, I think it's a case by case basis, because after that I talked with other Indian translators. I even talked to Daisy Rockwell at one point, asking her how she had managed it, because she's more senior than me in this field, and she told me she has some horror stories as well.
Okay.
So I think what happens is, if you are not with the Varsha Adalja translation, things were much easier. The writer is alive. I was already a known entity because of Dhumketu, the work I've already done. But if you're a brand new translator out the gate and nobody knows about you and you don't have a publishing contract yet, it's hard. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. It is not easy to deal with the family of, what you might have. And this is another reason why I would suggest get some of your translations published at certain venues. There are a lot of literary magazines now who are taking translated work, and they will tell you that, if you go to submittable.com, if you have some published translation work and then you approach the family of an author, it just puts you at a better position to talk with them and to negotiate with them about getting permission.
Awesome, that's helpful. Uh, so for those of you, if you're not familiar, there is a whole list of literary magazines that you can check out on pw.org, and then you can apply to the ones. You can sift for translation, you can sift for various genres to find which ones are accepting the kind of thing you might want to publish. And to actually submit to those literary magazines, submittable.com. It's the better place to go to is manager.submittable.com. That's a good central kind of clearinghouse of sorts where you just put your story and you can send it to 5, 10, 15 lit mags simultaneously. So that's just a tip. Lee has a next question. Have you also translated in the other direction from English to Gujarati? If so, which was more difficult?
I have done, as I think I mentioned, I've done some translation from English to Gujarati. It has not been published anywhere. It was used for, you know, um, copy for a book that was being published
Okay.
and stuff like that. Um, it's definitely harder for me to go from English to Gujarati than it is to go from Gujarati to English. I think it's just because I write in English as well. I, work in English, and so I think the Gujarati to English is certainly easier. And they do say, like, I'm doing translation workshops at the university now, right? And I talk to the academics who are in the Center for Translation Studies that we have here, and they'll tell you as well that as a translator, it is better if you are more proficient in the target language, that is the language you are translating into,
Yeah.
more so than the source language, because your audience, your readers, are in the target language. So you need to understand how to communicate this work to them in a way that they will find it smooth and easy reading, right? Not easy, but smooth and better reading. With the source language, as long as you're understanding it, as long as you have access to the right thesaurus, dictionary resources that you need to
Right.
be able to do the translation well. Now, the books that I end up selecting, unfortunately, have so much historical context, I end up going down many rabbit holes because some of them are using dialects, Gujarati dialects, that the words we don't talk like that anymore. We don't use those words anymore. So I have to go and double check some of those, you know. And so yeah, but I would say that definitely once you start translating in one direction, it's always easier to go in that direction. Doesn't mean
Sure.
that I will never do it the other way. I would love to be at a point in my career where I can do English to Gujarati as well, but we'll see.
Sure. Meenakshi has a question saying, thank you so much for this. I'm wondering how pitching to or submitting to Words Without Borders works and whether similar platforms are open to publishing retranslations. I'm not sure what a retranslation is.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. I'll answer both.
Sure.
So the pitching to Words Without Borders, I didn't pitch to them. They approached me, and I think they approached me because it was in 2022. My book had come out. The Dhumketu book had come out here in the U.S., and so they knew about it, and they'd never had any Gujarati translation published at Words Without Borders, and they said, "Oh, how would you like to guest edit an issue?" And so that's how that worked out. That's not always the case. I happened to be a known entity, so that's why they asked me. Um, but in terms of just going to other venues, I would definitely do what Chetan said, which is go to manager.submittable.com, search in the search bar, you can look for calls for translations, and there'll be a whole bunch of literary magazines that are looking for translations. Obviously, go and read the kind of work that they do. Look at the editorial masthead, who the editor is, try to work with people who are translators themselves and that kind of stuff, right? So I would say, yeah, try for that. In terms of so those are similar platforms. Now, in terms of publishing retranslations, I will tell you that even the literary magazines that are publishing, whether they're publishing translations or retranslations, if the work is not in the public domain, even for short stories, they will want to see that you have permission, even for a single short story. With the Words Without Borders thing, I had assembled a group of maybe 5, 6 Gujarati to English translators. Some of them were just translating small poems, and even then we needed to make sure they brought us permission letters and things like that, just because copyright is such a big problem otherwise. So, I would make sure that you have that. If you are doing a retranslation of something that is already in the public domain, then of course you don't need to get permission. You do need to mention to the venue. There are two things with retranslations. When you mention that it is a retranslation, you almost always, in your letter that you have to send along with your submission, you have to be specific as to why does this work deserve or need a retranslation. What is going to be different about your translation from the earlier work? A lot of times retranslations, right now, that's one of the big things I'm working on, and I'll probably write about it for We Are All Translators next on my website. The whole idea around multiple translations. It's almost like, I'll give you one quick example. Arabian Nights, okay? Centuries old, classic, has been translated many times by the British, the French, into many languages, right? And so a couple years ago, Yasmin Seal, who is an Arabic to English translator, did her own retranslation of the Arabian Nights, and it was very well received. She is the first woman translator to ever translate the Arabian Nights. She came at it from a very different angle, and it is what I would call a feminist translation. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean she changed things? No, she didn't change things. What she did was she added paratextual material, contextual material to make it a feminist translation. There are certain things you can do to make it something that it is not without changing the original text or whatever, right? So that's the reason she chose to retranslate a much translated work. She had very specific reasons and a very specific approach to do that. So yeah, I would say that if you're going to do retranslation, you need to have a very specific reason for it to then be accepted for publication. So yeah, I have yet to do so. I do hope to do so with a couple of Gujarati works that I feel deserve to be retranslated, but you need to think that through carefully.
Sounds great. The next question is, do you translate in natural spoken language, or do you aim to translate in difficulty/fancy language?
Yeah, I don't decide which language or which register. You're talking about the register, the natural spoken, because it's very much dependent. I translate fiction. It very much depends on the original work, the characters that are portrayed. Are they talking in a natural spoken register in the original? If so, that's what I need to bring across. Are they talking in a fancy elevated language in the original? If so, I need to bring that across. One of the important things we know with Indian language fiction in particular is that how a character speaks is often a signifier of their social status, right? So I'll give you one quick example. In the Varsha Adalja novel, there is a poor Brahmin family, widowed. And so there's this widow Brahmin woman who doesn't necessarily speak in an elevated tone, but she does speak as somebody who's educated, even in that time. There's this illiterate Muslim woman who comes and talks to her. Now, in the original, Varsha Adalja does not have to tell us anything about the social status about these two women. Just from the way they talk on the page, it is evident that one of them is higher caste and one of them is lower caste, right? And it is also evident that one of them is speaking Shuddha Gujarati and the other one is speaking kind of this blend of Hindi Gujarati. Now, that's very clear in the original. I am not going to change that in my English. That said, it's always harder for me to bring those dialects over, because in English everything is homogenized, and so I have to figure out ways to do stealth glossaries and things like that, so that my reader in English can also tell that these two women are from two different social classes. So I may
Right.
have to work with their speech patterns and things a little bit. But my goal is never for me to say, oh, I'm going to translate in this register or that register. That is not a decision you make independently. It depends very much on the source, the original.
Right. You've just got 5 minutes, but yeah. Last question: do you refer to any references in preparing for translation outside of the novel?
Oh, a lot. So, for example, with the Adalja novel, um, because of the time that it said, I mean, I went and I would look up each of the settings that she mentions. I would, if she mentioned a particular ritual, because she's writing about child marriage, she's talking about female infanticide, I would go and look up the historical stuff that was happening in Gujarat at the time. Again, my reason is it's not something that makes it onto the page explicitly, but me knowing that, I'm going to do a better job of making sure that I'm handling it more sensitively and with, so in a way, because, think about it, the original author knows a lot more about it. That's how she was able to write it.
Right.
I'm rewriting it in a different language. I also need to know a little bit about that history and that background. So I always say translators are not just converting stuff from one language to another. You are also a linguist, you are an anthropologist, you're a historian, you're wearing all these different hats because you have to do the research and
Sure.
understand, even if it doesn't explicitly make it onto the page. So I do definitely, I look at a lot of material. Even with Dhumketu, I had to go back. I read both his memoirs because I wanted to understand some of the influences and the reasons behind some of his stories. So yeah, I mean, I read as much as I can around the work.
Awesome. Well, this has been a great session.